Foundation.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Paul Harris and I am a past president and current member of the City Club's Board of Directors. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Gary Knell, President and Chief Executive Officer of National Public Radio, NPR. Mr. Knell's appearance today is timely as we approach Election Day and continue to be bombarded by so-called breaking news, headline news, and a plethora of political commercials. I think we're especially fortunate in that regard here in Ohio. To some extent, this activity reflects the vibrancy of our great American democracy, but sometimes the political season has been characterized by sound bites and superficiality at the expense of informed civic dialogue and debate. I'll come back to that subject in the specific context of the mission of our speaker's organization. Mr. Knell received his Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science from UCLA, where he served as editorial director of the UCLA Daily Bruin and also as a news correspondent for the Associated Press. He went on to earn his law degree from Loyola University School of Law in Los Angeles. Mr. Knell then embarked on a career in public media that has covered nearly 3 decades and multiple forms of media. He served as managing director of Manager Media International, a print and multimedia publishing company based in Bangkok, Hong Kong, and Singapore. He also served as senior vice president and general counsel at WNET Channel 13 in New York, as counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary and Governmental Affairs Committees, and in the California State Legislature and Governor's Office. In 1989, Mr. Knell began a career with Sesame Workshop, whose website describes the organization as, quote, the nonprofit education organization behind Sesame Street and so much more, end quote. He became Chief Operating Officer in 1998 and Chief Executive Officer in 2000, serving in the CEO capacity for 12 years before joining NPR. Mr. Knell played a lead role in the expansion of Sesame Street's global reach, including the creation of co-productions in Egypt, India, Northern Ireland, and South Africa. Mr. Knell joined NPR in 2011, and as president and CEO is responsible for NPR's worldwide media operations, which include partnerships with 900 public radio stations, including Greater Cleveland's own WCPN 90.3 FM. As chief executive, he has been a driver in NPR's use of emerging technologies to further NPR's mission and expand its reach. Now, in his spare time, if he has any, he serves among other capacities as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and on the boards of numerous entities, including National Geographic Education Foundation and Common Sense Media, whose CEO and founder, Jim Steyer, spoke here just a few years ago. Mr. Knell has been a guest lecturer at Harvard, Duke, Southern Methodist University, and the University of Puerto Rico, and as a commencement speaker at Johns Hopkins University, UCLA, and the University of Texas at Austin. Now, finally, back to the subject of NPR's mission and really the juxtaposition between that mission and the sometimes superficial civic dialogue environment. Shortly after joining NPR, Mr. Knell observed that public radio, quote, provides a vital service commercial radio simply cannot. In the coming years, NPR will be more important than ever. The media environment is increasingly crowded, chaotic, and complex. What people need is not just more information, but an ally to help them make sense of it all, end quote. I'm very pleased to present, on behalf of the City Club of Cleveland, Gary Knell, President and Chief Executive Officer of NPR.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. So I've traded in Big Bird for Nina Totenberg. So people are wondering, what have you done? But it was a really great decision, I think, in retrospect. The tenure of NPR CEOs, as you may have read in the news, is not probably one for a great career move for stability. There's been some turmoil. Paula Kerger, who's going to be here, I believe, for your 100th anniversary, the president of PBS, she and I are cooking up a new primetime TV series called NPR CEO Survivor. But we've made it close to our first year, and I want to thank two people here especially for helping make that happen. One is our Vice Chairman, Carol Cartwright. Thank you, Carol. Who's done so much in her leadership also at Kent State and at Bowling Green as well, and has been a great leader on the NPR board. And also someone who's very special from IdeaStream, who not only has been a great leader in public radio, but I'm happy to say, in fact thrilled to say, she will be the new chairperson of the board of National Public Radio, Kit Jensen. Kit. And my friend Jerry Wareham, he and I have spent a lot of time together in public media over the years, and I wanted to speak for a few minutes today and look forward to your questions about what NPR is about, but starting a little bit with the story of Sesame Street, because they're actually connected. And it's really about how one idea can change the world. Sesame Street was concocted really at a dinner party between a public affairs producer named Joan Gans Cooney and a foundation executive named Lloyd Morissette. And at this dinner party, they came up with the idea that, you know what, kids are learning from advertising about cereal and about candy and about all kinds of other things. Why don't we teach them letters and numbers? And let's use the techniques of advertising with the admission that television was the most powerful teacher ever invented in the history of mankind. And whether we think that's a good thing or not is besides the point. The fact is that television teaches. It's not whether it teaches, it's what does it teach. And I think we see now, as we can expand the word television to media, which includes radio, and it also includes the fire hose of information that we get every day, how those are really teachers. So there's a direct correlation, in my view, between Sesame Street and lessons for preschoolers, as well as at NPR. We were working for a long time at Sesame Workshop, for 30 years, won more Emmys than any show in television history. But along came the 1980s and 90s when cable television really grew, and you had all of a sudden rivals like Nickelodeon and Disney coming into the picture who were getting into the preschool space. And when we took over Sesame Workshop, we looked at the competitive framework and said, you know what, we can move over here because that's where the economics seem to be going and kids' viewing habits are changing. I mean, who would have thought that there would be 24/7 preschool programming? There are now 6 competing networks on cable television for those kids today. For 20 years, Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood were the only 2 preschool shows on American television. And last I counted, there were over 75 every day. So it's a huge different world out there. And we made a decision actually not to copy what those media conglomerates were doing and making an attempt at capturing the attention and interest of young kids, but to refocus again on the mission of using the media to help children reach their highest potential. And so we focused on a global expansion into the Arab world, into Israel, into China, India, South Africa, where we built an HIV-positive Muppet character to deal with the millions of kids in South Africa who are HIV positive through childbirth, who are dealing with stigmatization. And this was a way where you could learn to love someone or be friends with them and not necessarily get sick. This was a very important lesson for kids and the power of media, again, to make a difference in their lives. Or teaching tolerance and respect to children. Someone asked me in a talk yesterday at Kent State and the journalism school that, you know, what are the lessons that Sesame Street could have on the greater world? I said tolerance, respect, understanding, the idea of empathy, the idea of actions and the impact they have on others. We could use these on Capitol Hill. Right. So there's a reason why the Congress has a 10% approval rating now. 10%. And as I tell people, it's now down to friends and family. And maybe the family dog. But it's a statement. And the media owns part of this problem. And I think all of us in the room care about that, because when you get down to this level of disapproval, on both parties, by the way, this is basically a vote of no confidence in the system. And it's a vote of no confidence that seems to be getting worse, not better, and a dysfunction that is somewhat created by the lack of the civic civil dialogue, Paul, that you described that the City Club here in Cleveland tries to present each and every week. We hold that common purpose at National Public Radio. We focused at Sesame also on military families because we saw a need of a population of young kids whose parents were being deployed, redeployed again. 700,000 preschoolers of active duty military, guard, and reserves whose needs were not being addressed. And to deal with the stresses and traumas of comings and goings, and dad going off for another year, or mom in some cases, and dad coming home with post-traumatic stress disorder, or losing a leg from an IED on a road in Baghdad. This was a way in which we get people like Cuba Gooding Jr. and Queen Latifah and Katie Couric volunteering their time to create primetime specials for PBS, to focus on the grieving process for young children. Again, with the idea that we could use the power of the Muppets and the power of these iconic brands of Sesame Street to make a difference in people's lives. And I can't tell you how much the military has appreciated what we've done. Admiral Mullen himself invited me to, with the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, where we had Elmo in the Pentagon, speaking to the issues. But what Elmo was he was an icon representing young children in the military. And that's the power that these symbols can have in our culture, in our society. So we jump now to this opportunity at NPR. And I vowed to myself not to ever leave Sesame Street unless it was for something really good and really powerful that could have a bigger impact even than that powerful icon. At National Public Radio, was looking for someone, and I have been a huge fan and a major listener. No one had to teach me what Fresh Air or Morning Edition was. I probably listened to more episodes than half the people at NPR. But I felt that there was a leadership gap, and most importantly, a time now when we needed to promote what NPR is all about, because we had been letting other people brand us, and we'd also been letting, I think, this dialogue that's gone into camps and maybe even tribes, as the advertising guru Seth Godin likes to say, where people are now reinforced by an echo chamber on the left and the right. There's that lack of coming in the middle to discuss important issues about education, about energy, about environment, about foreign affairs. And I think for many years, NPR has created a news organization that was built in many similar ways to how Joan Cooney built Sesame Street. It was kind of like Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney out in the barn, let's go make a play. And instead we had people like Nina Totenberg and Susan Stamberg and Robert Siegel and Cokie Roberts and Linda Wertheimer and all these names that you're familiar with, who were in the proverbial barn as young 20-somethings out of J school or law school saying to themselves, you know, we're in Washington. We've got all these college radio stations around the country that are not connected. Let's create a news service to cover the Supreme Court, the Congress, the White House, et cetera. Let's see what can happen here, get a couple of grants, put it together. And they did. And it was based on that dream. And I'm sure they never, ever dreamt that this would become what it's become today. A viable, vibrant community of 270 licensees who are out there covering the globe, covering the nation, and covering local communities. Covering the globe with people like Soraya Sarhadi Nelson on the streets of Cairo, who was there for the Arab Spring and was not simply a network news reporter who could jet in, do a stand-up, and jet back home. This is somebody who was living in Cairo, smelling the smells, eating the food, interacting with local populations, understanding that the Arab Spring in many ways had a lot to do with young men not being able to get jobs and being dissed by their girlfriends because the lack of a meritocracy in Egypt and a perceived corruption of the government was keeping them, at least how they felt, from advancing financially and economically to the point where there was time to make a change. So you wouldn't know that story unless you were on the ground. And we've been on the ground there. We've been on the ground in Baghdad and Kabul. In Kabul, our amazing reporters have, one of whom called me, I remember one of my first days on the job, saying, Gary, the one thing we need here is more security. The only thing I have, my security detail is a German shepherd named Jack Bauer. Right? So we got him another German shepherd. But we, more importantly, tried to really tell Quill Lawrence, our reporter at the time, that we have his back, that he needs to be on the ground and interview the U.S. ambassador in Kabul so that Americans can understand and need to be reminded that we are at war, that we have troops over there, that we are putting our men and women in harm's way, and we not forget about them. And I think that's part of what the mission of what NPR is all about, in covering the world. Having Sylvia Poggioli, who we've all loved and heard for years, covering the Euro debt crisis out of Greece and Italy. This is important for those of us who like Italy and like to travel. But it's more important is what does it mean to you as an American? What does it mean to us in Northern Ohio about our 401ks? How are the decisions being made by the IMF and the Greek parliament going to impact my future, my children's future, the national debt of the United States, the interactions between China and Africa, all these issues that are being going on around the world that are impacting our daily lives here in Cleveland? This is what NPR is trying to tell, and those stories they're trying to tell that are too often just not being told anymore as newspapers seem to be going south for economic reasons, and we see commercial radio pretty much abandoning news and serious discussion, and we see a big gap there. There's 35 million listeners of public radio in this country every week. It's a huge number. 3.5 million of them donate to public radio stations. That's a lot of people, because they don't have to donate a penny. They can get all this for free. There's no paywall. So this is about a public radio system that people gather around and want to support. And they've decided that this is time and this is something they want to see keep going. And I think it is about probably a lot of those 90% of the people giving the Congress a disapproval rating who want to have a civil dialogue about these issues and are just darn frustrated about the lack of conversation that we can have about solving this crisis of dropouts in Cleveland, which is a complex question about teachers, administrators, students, technology, physical plants, preschool education, childbirth, healthcare. These are all interrelated. And unless you have the knowledge base to look at these in more of a global context, you can't really make the right calls or try to make the right calls around a question around school performance in Cleveland or wherever we are in America. This is what we're trying to do on a national basis. So our regional editor, Ken Barkas, who's here, who's working with many local stations in the Midwest to build up that local capacity, to make sure that people are finding examples of excellence around the country so we can learn from each other. This is the connectivity of the National Public Radio network of stations also, which are serving hundreds of communities around America. And we have news bureaus in Helena, Montana, and in Wyoming and in Alaska that will go away should public funding go away for public broadcasting. Because unlike some places where there is a lot of philanthropic support or corporate underwriting, at some of these stations, 50% of their funding is publicly subsidized. And I don't think it does taxpayers a lot of good to not have the state legislature in Montana being covered by journalists. Which gets me really around to the last point I want to make, which is about journalism versus information. They're different. We live now in a fire hose of data, which comes at us from Facebook and Twitter. And journalism is about reporting, sourcing. It's about having an editor fact-checking. It's about an editor asking a reporter, you know what, you want to tell a story about a physician that you think did something wrong, you better be darn sure you got the facts right. And having a third-party validation of those facts, as opposed to what is too often out there, which are people's theories, people's comments, people's opinions, which is fine. That's the country we live in. We're entitled to have those comments, and we should have those comments. And cable television and talk radio should exist, and they should prosper. But we also need something called journalism, because this is really about telling as much as we can, going through a process of fact-finding that is taught at Kent State University and is taught at other journalism schools around the country. It's about trying to seek the truth as much as you can. And it's about accuracy and being fair, which is more important than anything these days. So as NPR moves into a future, we think we have to promote the idea of journalism. And we join with brethren and sistren in the newspaper business and others in the broadcast business who agree with that as well. We think that's really important, especially in an era when digital disruption is happening to our lives every day. I throw this out a little bit loosely, and I don't think this is scientifically true, but it's pretty true, that there's no one under the age of 30 reading a newspaper. And I do a lot of speaking on college campuses, and I ask that question all the time. And I don't mean 20%, I mean no one. So the question is then, now they're reading the newspaper online, they're getting news from other sources. The question is, how do we build a citizenry that has that kind of complexity of data that people need to have to make decisions about who to vote for and decisions about these complex issues globally, nationally, and locally? That's what NPR is all about. So we're going to continue to work with WCPN and colleagues around the country who are doing brilliant local work in their communities on their terrestrial radio stations as people are stuck in traffic jams. We actually kind of like traffic jams. That's going to get me into trouble. But we also know that there's a digital reality that is taking place, especially with younger people, who are going to want to access and are already accessing the world through iPhones and through tablets. And they want to have a Pandora-type engagement in news. And this is something that we're going to need to work on. We are already working on. We believe that NPR has a bright future in reaching populations, diverse populations, ethnically, to mirror more of a changing demographic in America, from our younger people, from those who might have different political perspectives, and those geographically outside of the Beltway, so that we're not just mirroring this endless circle of commentary that gets really old to me. I don't know how it gets to you. So we have to be careful about diversifying our voices, build our national, local strength, and being out there as part of the digital revolution. So none of us at NPR have the luxury to stay in one place. We have to stay hungry. We have to disrupt ourselves, because I think the public really does have a desire for this civic civil dialogue like the City Club. And we are thrilled that you invited us here today, because we really do stand in common cause that way, about trying to present people with different points of view so that people can make up their own minds with the information that is necessary in the complex world in which we all live. Thank you so much for having me today.
We are honored to have today with us Gary Knell, President and CEO of National Public Radio. As we here at the City Club of Cleveland are reminded every week, the City Club enjoys a very special relationship with our local public radio station, WCPN 90.3 FM Idea Stream. And joining us today at the head table are Kit Jensen and Jerry Wareham, the two leaders of Idea Stream. So I'd ask you to please stand and be recognized. Now, we will return to our speaker momentarily for the traditional City Club questions. Please start formulating your questions now, and please try to keep them short and to the point and really ask a question. Our goal is to get as many questions in as possible. We welcome all of you here and those listening to 90.3 WCPM Idea Stream, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS Idea Stream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Closed captioning of our programs is made possible by the Nordson Corporation. Today we welcome guests at tables hosted by IdeaStream and also by WKSU. Thank you all for your support. Today is the annual WCLV Forum made possible by a generous gift from Robert and Jean Conrad. Joining us today at the head table is Robert Conrad. Will you please stand to be recognized? We would also like to recognize students from St. Edward High School. Students are here today as part of the City Club student program. Today's student attendance is made possible by a gift from the Freddie Scholl Foundation, Bernard L. Carr, Chairman. Will the students please stand and be recognized? Thank you for joining us, and remember, students are free to answer questions as well. Now we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests and students. Holding the microphone today is City Club 100th Anniversary Assistant Director Betsy Wallace and City Club Program Director Carrie Miller. First question, please.
Thank you. Would you please explain the relationship of PBS and NPR and what the difference is?
Sure. Do you have a couple hours? No. The Public Broadcasting Act was signed in the late 60s, and PBS and NPR were chartered, really, back then as entities. They are both membership organizations. in which local 501c3, local stations, local nonprofit stations in television and radio, most of them are actually different, IdeaStream is an exception, exist in local communities. Many are university-owned licensees like WKSU, they then pay dues and program fees to PBS for Nova and Frontline and the NewsHour, or to NPR for Morning Edition and All Things Considered. So we are the biggest difference between NPR and PBS is NPR is probably the largest content producer of public radio, and PBS doesn't really produce programs. They're more of a bundler of programs that are then sold to the system. So it's very much a locally driven enterprise where the power really does exist in local communities at both the PBS and the NPR level.
Mr. Knell, I'd like to direct your attention to the national in National Public Radio and ask you to set your enterprise in a global context, and to do it in two ways. One is to tell me what you've learned about how NPR may be distinctive and different from other comparable public broadcasting endeavors around the world. I have no idea what your answer might be. On the other, I do have a sense of what you might do. I have an example of something which I've been startled to learn about how civic life in Australia goes forward. They took a participation rate in voting that was comparable to ours, around 40s, 50s, bumping up to the 60s, charged people $15 if they didn't vote, and took their participation up to almost 95%. Could you comment?
Not on that. No, somebody, of course, the BBC always comes up to me as the example of, how public broadcasting should work. Now, the BBC, for those of you who don't know, is funded by something called a license fee, which is paid for owning a television, okay? And I think, what is it now, 150 pounds a year? It's, it's a pretty hefty tax, let's call it what it is. I think if we proposed a public broadcasting tax of $250 a year, I think the Capitol would be burned down. So this is not going to happen. So look, the answer to your question, there's an interesting history lesson here that as broadcasting grew after the war, in the U.S., the private sector actually was the innovator and the builder of the broadcasting system in the United States, and the opposite was true in Europe. So in Britain, France, Germany, you go down the list, Spain, everywhere, Holland, these were state broadcasters that then private broadcasters were afterthoughts that came later, as late as like the 1990s even. In the U.S., public broadcasting was in some ways came in as the latecomer. And in fact, the commercial networks donated studios and money to public broadcasters who really got going more in the 1960s as an independent enterprise and then became a full-fledged kind of network in the 1970s. So you have to look at kind of the birth of these institutions. The ABC in Australia, which you mentioned, is another one of those. You had a state broadcaster, and then you had other people come in later, like Rupert Murdoch, actually, and others, who created private networks. And it's very much had an influence on the evolution of these public media organizations. So we have been, I think, rightfully focused on filling niches that the commercial media has not developed well, and whether that's for Sesame Street, because when you think about it, there was no real preschool show teaching kids, right? It created actually an entire, genre of television, which has now been emulated on 6 competing cable networks, 40 years later. or in history programming, or in in opera and classical music, and you go on science programming. All these things were really innovated. The first tennis matches were on PBS, right? The first televised tennis matches. So these things were built on public television because the commercial media was not in them. It just so happened when cable came along, they sort of took a lot of things, and that's where the Discovery Channel came from, A&E, the Golf Channel, the Tennis Channel. You go down the list. They're all kind of niches of what was innovated at PBS. So they do have different backgrounds. I don't like to compare necessarily the two because they come from such different places. The BBC is so much a part of, it's kind of motherhood apple pie in the BBC, and they actually call it, Mother BBC. And I don't think that's a reality that we're ever going to see, probably nor should see in this country. So we need to keep, though, especially as the news media is shifting, as we have talked about here, we need to keep pushing at journalism. We need to keep pushing at classical music. We need to keep pushing at jazz and singer-songwriter music and folk alley and other things that the commercial radio industry, rather, has abandoned pretty much for financial reasons. But there's a real need and a desire and enough of a strong group of like-minded individuals who can come together to philanthropically support these enterprises through the private sector, and that's where we're going to continue to work. Hi there.
Mr. Knell, during your talk today, you pointed out the truly outstanding work which National Public Radio and by inference National Public Television have done in covering news throughout the world. And you certainly had, and both of you have had an exemplary history of doing this in a very fair-minded way, covering both sides of the various issues. Notwithstanding these very, very positive things, a dark cloud appeared just this past year when very conservative members of Congress attempted to reduce and perhaps cut off completely the funding to National Public Radio and National Public Television. My question is, what more can you possibly do to avoid that kind of problem from occurring again?
Good question. We are, public broadcasting has had bipartisan support for its entire existence, pretty much. Every president has supported funding for public broadcasting, Democrat and Republican, over its 45-year existence, always been in the president's budget. I think, Jerry, this is correct, that it's never even been proposed to be cut in president's budgets. But if it has, it's been pretty much stable funding or increases. We have worked hard trying to maintain that bipartisan coalition. I think as what we've spoken about today, as our polarized news ecology has grown, it has empowered some who believe that we are not capturing enough of the range of views that they happen to believe. And there is opposition that has grown over time that was not helped along by some self-inflicted wounds, frankly, that NPR created for itself a couple of years ago. So we have, since I've been in the job, we have reached out to try to build coalitions across party lines. I've had lots of meetings with leaders from both sides of the aisle on the Hill to try to build confidence that we do take this fairness seriously. We do take the responsibility of having all voices heard seriously, and that this is everyone's public radio. And I think we're making progress. But the thing that matters most is really not what I say or what the head of PBS says. It's what you are telling your members of Congress who are voting on these issues, because on whatever issue it is, because if they don't feel there's any consequence to a vote for or against, they're just going to do what sort of they're told to do. And I think what we need to do is make sure that voices who do care about public broadcasting are out there and making their views known to their members of Congress. That makes a huge difference, whether it's a school issue or a public broadcasting issue or whether it's about a highway in your neighborhood. This is basic civics 101, and we're no different. So that would be my answer on what to do about it.
Yes, thank you so much for giving us this wonderful talk. A few years ago, we were in the Middle East and had the privilege of visiting Al Jazeera. We were fascinated by it, amazed by the distance there seems to be between the United States and the Arab countries. And it appeared to me that Al Jazeera is very similar to PBS. Do we work with them at all? And how is this interrelationship going?
Well, just as a matter of clarification, I'm not here on behalf of PBS, so they are a completely separate organization. We have, there are a lot of news organizations around the world. Al Jazeera was birthed with a lot of journalists from the BBC, trained by the BBC, and over time has grown into quite an influential news source in the Middle East especially, and in Europe for that matter, that is now more and more available, I've noticed, in the U.S. as an important, I think, voice for the region, at least covering different perspectives. We don't have a direct relationship with them. We believe, and I happen to believe passionately, and this goes to the gentleman's question in the corner, that we need American reporters covering the world, that we have Americans who are at least understanding how these issues in the Middle East are impacting us at home, being able to tell those stories. And this is why NPR has maintained a foreign bureau expansion at a time when newspapers and television networks have pretty much withdrawn from the world with foreign bureaus. I think the network news bureaus are pretty much down to 1 or 2, literally. So they're not even in Baghdad anymore. So we have people who are covering those things, and I think that's much more about what we want to be, and that's what we're going to be focused on.
Current, the public broadcasting newspaper, had an article last week which stated that after reaching an all-time high in listeners, public talk and news stations now have experienced a definite drop in the number of people who are listening. Any comments?
I do. There's an industry version of that, and then there's I think part of it is the ratings measurement systems have changed, and they're somewhat confusing, to be honest. There's also people listening on mobile apps and tablets that are not being calculated. It's kind of like what you guys have been hearing about these pollsters in Ohio who are not picking up people who have cell phones. They're just calling people on landlines, which leaves out a lot of people, right? Especially younger people who get completely left out of the polls because of that. So we're facing some similar questions about that. But the bigger issue here is what we've seen. There's a new Gallup poll that came out last week that there's been a big lowering of trust in news overall in the country over the last decade. And it's actually quite shocking what has happened about just trust in news organizations. NPR has actually been one of a couple where we have been bucking that trend. And the network news, I remember organizations especially have been going like this. And part of it, I think, is because the theme I was trying to make before, the definition of news is confusing to people. So things that are called news are not really journalism, they're really opinion. So do I trust this network or that network? Not really, because I really feel like I'm being, given somebody's opinion. But so that's kind of spun across to discredit, I think, the news industry and the news business overall. And I think we need to go back, frankly, and tell people a better story about journalism and what it's all about and some of the themes that I was discussing earlier. And remind people that it is about, it is about trying to find out about the governor of a state who's doing something that may not be so terrific, but we got to check our facts, and we got to make sure that that's true, and that's why we have reporters and editors, and there's a process to this, and I think it's that process that's gotten lost in this whirlwind of information that is assaulting our breast pockets through our cell phones, going off with emails and Twitter feeds every 2 seconds, and the avalanche of information that we're getting every single day.
My question is regarding foreign affairs. Americans generally tend to be not very interested in foreign affairs or have much knowledge. They still struggle between difference between Iran and Iraq and so on and so forth. Even though we have been there for 10, 12 years. My question is that how do you change the people's desire or change their desire to want to know more about foreign affairs rather than just because the national media have basically abandoned, as you said. Can NPR make a difference where people force to understand what's going on and how our relationship is, and hopefully have an impact on the rest of the media to make more an effort?
Keep doing it. I mean, look, I think you hit it on the head. It's been abandoned, and I think we do this at our own peril. We live in a globalized economy. We live in a world where events in China impact people's jobs in northern Ohio. I mean, I don't have to tell you that. This is what's happening. And if we don't have journalists who are covering these connections and these issues, we do this at our own peril. Now, I know that members of Congress listen to us on both sides of the aisle because I get phone calls from senators who say, oh, I heard that story about blah, 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 blah. It's fantastic, right? And then they complain about something else. But it's there. We have to make sure that we are continuing our work, and I think that's what makes us different. And I think I would be thrilled if other news organizations expanded their foreign coverage as well, following our lead. I think this is something that we cannot give up on. And for our children's sake, I'm very passionate about this. I've lived overseas. I have traveled the world. I've built children's programs all over the world. You know, Americans need to understand the global complexities of the world we live in, and also what is America's role in the world so that we can have jobs and we can manage our affairs and we can raise our kids in the world that they are inheriting from us. So I think there's a very important role for us to play to continue to tell those stories about the difference between Iran and Iraq, as you said, and especially then when you throw in the military implications of our troops, then you get me really worked up. And I think that, you know, senior military leaders listen to NPR all the time. And I can tell you that when Renee Montagne goes over to Afghanistan, she's mobbed by some of our troops who know her because they listen to her all the time, because they know that we're the only ones in there telling the stories about what's going on back home. And we're living too much ignoring the fact that we've got tens of thousands of young men and women in Afghanistan still. Who's talking about it? And we need to be talking about it every day on Morning Edition, and we do. And so I think we just got to continue to do it. And we will influence, we know we're influencing leaders, but we need to grow that influence in the public. This is a broader societal issue about education, but it's one that we play a key role in.
I wonder if you can comment about two, or elaborate on two trends. One you alluded to in your comment was that increasingly we're hearing we're operating in news silos where we hear echo chambers of people that we want to hear rather than necessarily challenging us. And the second is the proliferation of organizations that are designed to try and fact check and get counter information out there. Is that a substitute for journalists doing it themselves because they always have that backup?
Well, it's a good question, and I think it's important. We are not perfect. I don't mean to imply that everything NPR does is, absolutely perfect. We make mistakes, but this is not an organization with a political agenda. And I think you have to understand that there is a difference between those who do have a political agenda, by the way, on all sides, this isn't one or the other, versus those who are trying to at least present an accurate view of the world. So we can be corrected. We have an ombudsman who does not report to the newsroom. He actually reports directly up to me, which annoys the newsroom. But when somebody complains about bias or complains about our coverage in some part of the world or feels that we're politically leaning towards helping one candidate or another, he's there to take those, and he will do a deep dive and actually publish findings. And you can go on npr.org and find the ombudsman. He publishes every week about complaints that we get, and sometimes he'll say, you know what, they're right about this. And we don't like to hear it, but we'll go in and, if necessary, correct ourselves or clarify something. And other times he'll say, well, the listener didn't really get what they were trying to say here. So we're trying to build in a policy where we're open to criticism in a way where there's a process to field these. But I think it's important that we try to recognize the difference between sort of political agendas and agendas at reporting the news, and they're somewhat different. When we talk about Tahrir Square in Egypt, I use that as an example, and someone's tweeting, I'm about to get hit in the head with a stick, and then the next tweet is, I just got hit in the head with a stick, and the immediate reaction might be, oh, that's terrible. Well, you don't know that, actually. You don't know if that person was a victim of oppression, or it was actually doing something not so great to somebody else and maybe deserved to get, something happen. You don't know. You don't know the facts on the ground. And that's a reporter's job, is to figure out, and we actually have a guy named Andy Carvin who is looking at Twitter feeds, that's his whole job, in the Middle East and trying to sort this stuff out, so that he can build a cadre of reliable sources through social media that can rethink and recreate a news feed that Americans and through NPR can respect and understand. So it's a very fast-changing world. There's new websites that are being invented every day of checkups on checkups on checkups on checkups. But let's try to sort out who's trying to report the news and who's trying to advance a political agenda.
To reaffirm your comment about the young people, I was talking with my friends over here. No, we do not read newspapers.
No one should applaud.
But it's not that we don't care.
Right.
We do read on our tablets and on our phones and stuff. And to go with your comment about the Pandora news station, is that a possibility? And if it is, where do we sign up?
Well, we're working on it. But as I told the J students at Kent State, you gotta help us. This is a lot of reverse mentoring, because you guys are digital natives and we're digital immigrants. So you guys are the ones who are much more masterful at understanding how to sort out kind of a belief system of who you trust and who you don't trust. We need to figure out a way of gathering these new pieces of information in digestible chunks that build that information base that are important for people to understand, be it about education or science or health or what have you. So I think actually there is tremendous opportunity for you guys in high school and in college to take this amazing technology that has been invented in your lifetimes. I mean, the iPhone didn't exist 5 years ago. Think about this, okay? And now it's, changed everyone's life. or many people's lives, and the iPad and all of these other things. You have an opportunity now to rethink how do we do this. So we're working on Pandora-like applications where if you're interested in science, let's say, you can now have a deep dive of all of the last 10 science stories through NPR or through IdeaStream that came up here in Cleveland or in education or whatever. So we're working at it, but we're going to need young people like you to really make it happen and tell us that we got it right. You too can be the next Mark Zuckerberg. Hi.
This may sound like a plant. Of individual listeners, I'm interested in what percentage of the American population listens, and then among those, what percentage contributes, and how much has that changed over time?
Okay, so there's about 35 million listeners a week, so you can figure out the math. 12% of the public? I don't know, what is the math? Something like that. Which is a pretty big number, actually. And when you look at raw numbers of people, I mean, certainly on radio, Morning Edition and All Things Considered are both in the top 5 rated radio shows, top 4 rated, boy, that's hard to say. The top 4 rated shows on the radio overall. So there's big numbers of people listening. 3.5 million of the 35 million give money, which is about a 10% rate. And if you thought about this in the newspaper business, if you had 10% of your people going online actually paying you money voluntarily, you'd be very happy. So this is a business model that is pretty good, but we still need to keep improving our content and improving ways of reaching our audiences through our member stations, and we're going to continue to work on that. Thanks. Okay, Mark. Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring Gary Knell, President and Chief Executive Officer of NPR. Thank you very much, Mr. Knell. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
PNC